Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to this very special broadcast here at the Conference Board. We're going to share with you some new research and have an opportunity to hear directly from practitioners around what they thought about the research and their ability to be involved in it. Before we move directly into that, I should mention also that this is an opportunity for you to earn recertification credits. And as you can see on the screen, in most cases you need to put your full name, your email address, and which type of certification credits you'd like. Notice also that on the third one for CPE, you do have to remain upright and alert in the chair, because at 3 different moments in the webcast today, you'll be asked to click OK so that we know that you're not a robot. So let me just say welcome again. I have just the privilege today to have with me Mike Prokopic, who, as you can see there, is the Vice President and Editor-in-Chief of Human Capital Media. But it's been my privilege to work with him as part of the advisory board for Chief Learning Officer magazine. We go way, way back, and it's just a thrill to have you with me. And thank you, Mike.
Thank you for having me here as well, Rebecca. I definitely appreciate the partnership that we've had with the Conference Board, and I'm looking forward to spending some time with you today, as well as the folks who are attending.
Terrific, terrific. Thank you, Mike. You know, what we hope to do today is just a couple of things. I mean, the bulk of what we're going to do today is share with you a great panel presentation from the 2017 CLO Symposium. We were very privileged to have some great folks, and more about that in a moment. We're going to talk a little bit about the research report and how you can obtain a copy. And we're also going to share a little bit about the next phase of this research and how you can get involved. And then I'm a big fan of the CLO Symposium series. I learned a great deal, and I never met a good idea didn't steal. So I'm going to ask Mike to talk a little bit about the one that's just on the horizon in the coming weeks. So having said that, let me just set the stage for you. We completed a piece of research in partnership with DDI and also RW2 Enterprises, and it was an opportunity for us to partner with some great organizations. And I was so privileged to be at the symposium at Mike's invitation, and we had the sitting CHROs from Boeing and from Johnson & Johnson, as well as 2 outstanding millennial leaders to talk about the research that they were involved in and how that plays itself out at Boeing and at J&J. So without further ado, let me suggest that we move into the video itself, and then Mike and I will have some thoughts about getting involved and accessing the research and the symposium when this is done. I'm going to talk a little bit about some brand new research, and the thrill here is that we worked with some iconic companies and the great work that they're doing, building the emerging leader populations at their respective organizations. We worked with 14 of them. I'm going to share a little bit more about that, but I'm so privileged to have 2 companies represented today. And as you can see, we have a few folks with us, and so let me just introduce them briefly and then talk a little bit about the work that we collectively did and some of the highlights. I'm going to do my very best. You know I'm loquacious, but I'm going to do my very, very best to have them speak most of the time. So I'm going to share a highlight, and then I'm going to turn it right over and say, and what did you think? Or how does this play itself out at Johnson & Johnson or at Boeing? So I'm absolutely thrilled that they came across town to join us. They actually flew in from Seattle or Chicago or New Brunswick. And so I thank you for doing that. So this, you know, fine. Heidi Kaposi is the Chief Human Resources Officer at the Boeing Company and was instrumental in marshaling the troops for us as we began to work on this study. Heidi, thank you very much for coming.
Very pleased to be here. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you. I've come to know Susan Weiss a bit. She's one of the outstanding millennial leaders at the Boeing Company, and when she begins to tell her story, you'll be as impressed as I was with many of the millennial leaders that we met at these organizations, at just how incredible a role these folks have. Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Rebecca.
We're also privileged to have 2 representatives from Johnson & Johnson. Dr. Peter Fasolo is the Chief Human Resources Officer there, and appreciate the opportunity to partner with you and your team and to get all of this in motion. Thank you, Peter.
Great, Rebecca. Glad to be here.
And finally, Short Gehring, who leads the global talent acquisition process. I noticed that you have several patents pending. I need to bend your ear a little bit about that. I think that's probably another whole panel. But not only does he play a role here in the human capital space, he is also one of the rising millennial leaders at Johnson & Johnson. So thank you for being here. So what I'd like to do today is talk about a report that we have just issued. This is the report, and it is something my mother has found very interesting in reading it. But I also think that it's an important piece of research that was in partnership with our colleagues at DDI. I don't know if Rich Wellens is in the room. Perhaps not. I know one of the other co-authors is Elise Wright, who's sitting here in the audience, and she is part of the RW2E group and an instrumental part of the research as well. So I'm here to talk about a piece of research, but there were many hands on this, so I'm going to try to do it justice. So all of us read the headlines about millennials, and sometimes they are not particularly true or flattering or pervasive. How many of you consider yourself part of the millennial generation? Okay. And I would say that, when we started to do the research, just about every generation from the Greeks was knocked coming in. In fact, you can go back to Herodotus, and it's, they're needy, they don't respect authority, they don't do this. And so, I think every generation has its moment of that as they enter into the workplace and take increasingly larger roles in society. But I think it's important to take a look at what research tells us, as opposed to the trendy headlines that sometimes catch your attention, but maybe are not defensible. Now, there's several things out there in the marketplace around millennials in general, and they are global in nature, research-based, defensible, some really great work. One book I'd recommend is Alex Levinan and Jennifer Deal's What Millennials Want in the Workplace, if you haven't discovered that. What we wanted to do, though, was a little different. We wanted to take a look at the emerging leaders coming from that generational cohort. And we wanted to find out whether or not there's something inherently different in the DNA, or whether or not they are a snapshot in time, as all of us were as we came through the leadership pipeline. So that's what we wanted to find out in this report. We're talking about millennials here, and in any generational research, I think you have to be very careful. There are different start and stop times. Sometimes things that work in Western or even the United States may not be transferable. But generally, the accepted range is somewhere between 1980, 1982, and 2000. And so what we wanted to do was to determine whether or not these folks are inherently different, what's different about them. What we found was that most of this can be attributed to life stage and not necessarily a generational difference. There are some differences, and there are some things to be mindful of. But I thought I would share with you some of the highlights of the report and how we got there. So first of all, we were fortunate to partner with 14 different organizations, and we had extraordinary access. We asked for an interview with the CEO. We asked for a focus group with C-suite leaders, and we asked for a focus group. In many cases, we had several focus groups with millennial leaders. We asked leaders at all levels to complete an online survey. And we also had the great privilege of interviewing folks like Heidi and Peter and their colleagues at these organizations, as well as the folks who lead leadership development efforts, to try to find out what people were doing differently, if anything, and how things were going. And so we had great, extraordinary access. I have to say that as someone who spent a professional lifetime in looking at leadership development and how to be effective, for me to have had the opportunity to sit across the table from Dennis Muhlenberg, or from Alex Gorski, or from Ken Chenault at American Express, or from Ursula Burns at Xerox, and to have them talk about their very personal leadership journeys was a professional privilege. So at the bottom of the screen, you can see that we tapped the wisdom of about 2,800 people. We looked at millennials either early or later in their leadership, higher or lower levels of their leadership journey. And we looked at non-millennial leaders at different stages of their leadership journey also. So we are looking at CEOs as an intact team of 14. We are looking at millennials, both early level leaders and higher level leaders, and then non-millennial leaders at a lower level and then a higher level of leadership. And obviously, you could have a millennial leader who is at a higher leadership level in an organization than perhaps his or her non-millennial cohort, okay? So I'll try to explain any of those differences that are perhaps key, but that's the way we looked at the different populations here. We think there were quite a few findings in the report. We can't cover them all today, but I'm going to touch on a few. So let me share with you some of the findings that we have and then ask for the wisdom of this panel. So one of the questions we wanted to ask, are leadership skills different in terms of how they're valued by different generational levels? So this is what we found. It's a little bit of an eye chart, but you can see right away that the top one is about coaching and engaging employees across the board, regardless of the generation, regardless of the level, regardless of whether or not you sit in the CEO's chair. You can also see that managing and successfully introducing change is a very strongly held value. So is coaching and developing others, although not so much at the CEO level. Interesting to note that the one about executing challenging courses of action was the one that all the CEOs ranked as one of their top 5. It was a tie and not something picked up by some others. So let me just have that kind of wash over you like a gentle breeze. Know that they had about 20 of these to select from. It's not that all the things on the list weren't important. It's just that when you have a forced ranking, some things naturally fall to the bottom. So then let me ask you this. When you think about leadership skills at Johnson & Johnson, does that start to resonate, or are there things that perhaps have a slightly heavier emphasis?
Well, why don't I, first of all, thank you for having us be part of this piece of research. What was, I think, just before I get to the answer, I think very impactful about this body of research for certainly at us at Johnson & Johnson was to get a more research-based approach to what's happening with millennials in the workforce. What I found very intriguing by the research was a trend of companies who have more and more engaged millennials happen to have significantly higher growth rates in their industries, which I thought was very interesting, certainly to us. What this body of research told us about the leadership skills that mattered most for millennials was the fact that coaching, mentoring, the face-to-face interactions that this cohort of leaders want in the organization is at a different metabolic rate. They certainly want coaching and mentoring, and they look at face-to-face interactions not as what the CEOs would look at in terms of what my generation might call stakeholder management, moving the system. What this generation certainly talks about is this is our learning style. This is how we've grown up, and this is how we stay connected. So what matters very much to this leadership cohort is connectivity, face-to-face interactions, purposeful for sure, but real time in terms of what maybe a CEO in my generation might see.
Do you find that millennials at Johnson & Johnson tend to be rather comfortable speaking up and sharing as opposed to an earlier generation where we might have waited to be asked?
I think very much so. Not even just here in the U.S., but I remember one of my first trips to China when I was at J&J, and we had our head of China host an event with earlier in career leaders, and reflecting on that conversation with him afterwards, he said, had I done that discussion 10 years ago, I would have maybe gotten 1 or 2 questions, very respectful questions, very obvious ones for me to answer. This was a very different discussion. They challenged him. They asked about pay and comp. They asked about the corporate strategy of the organization moving forward. So I think across the board, we're seeing a generation who is much more comfortable in challenging the status quo and a great level of ownership within the organizations they work for.
Yeah, I think that level of, I don't want to say informality, I'm not sure that that's quite the right word, but that comfort level of reaching out and connecting much earlier in your career and not feeling as though you're constrained by where you are in the organizational level. So thank you. I'm wondering if that plays itself out the same way at Boeing.
Well, first of all, I guess I'd sort of echo what Peter said too. I mean, this was probably one of the first decisions I made getting into the CHRO job at Boeing, was to participate in this research, in part because we had so many different perspectives on what was going on with this generation, and as you pointed out, not a lot of real sort of basis for what we were talking about. So, I don't know that you've explained, Rebecca, that there's aggregate results and then there's company results, and we've obviously spent some time digesting ours as well. I think a couple of takeaways, both in terms of what wasn't there and what was there. We noticed quite candidly that our millennial leaders, when they talked about the top leadership skills for them, did not mention managing change or dealing with ambiguity. And yet in all of the non-millennial leaders, that stood out significantly. And as we probed on that, definitely the millennial leaders said, we're different that way. We're used to change. We're comfortable in change, and so it wasn't as much on our radar screen. And from you take that back to a leadership development perspective, very interesting. And being comfortable in change oneself is not necessarily the same as being able to take a team or a group or an organization through transformation. And so I think, maybe some opportunities for us as we talk about that capability and help develop that in our millennial leaders early on.
Thank you. I did neglect to mention that there is the aggregate study, which is publicly available, but there were 14 sets of individual reports that we hope, are helpful as you continue to build on the great things that you do. Susan, I know you have an incredible scope in your role. Would you agree with some of those leadership values as sort of being top of the list?
Yeah, I really would. And similar to what Heidi shared, I think, I grew up in an environment like many millennials where change was constantly happening around me. And so that's not necessarily something that I feel is difficult for me to grasp. I think the thing that really resonated with me in the aggregate results was I see a lot of what I'll call negative press about millennials and who we are and why we act, and to see that really the skill sets and the things we value are relatively the same across the generations, all the way to the CEO, especially around inspiring and engaging employees and making that meaningful connection no matter who you work with, but that they feel empowered and listened to and kind of inspired by the work that we do. I think that's what leads to good results.
No, I think that's on point. I have to say, in the millennial focus groups that we did, I can't tell you how many times millennial leaders said to me, or to those of us who were doing them, and we did divide the challenges. They said, we have such negative press. First of all, don't label us. We don't like the term millennial. And I think part of that is because the press has been so merciless. And many of them said, we have to work twice as hard to be thought of as half as good. And I said, well, welcome to being a woman. I mean, sorry, my filters are not quite up. It's a little early. So, but I think it is true. I have the privilege of working with millennials at the conference board, and they are just outstanding. Maybe we're just lucky, but I don't think so. But they are incredibly hard workers and smart and fast and quick. But I heard that a lot, sort of this sort of mantle that they kind of try to carry on, I think.
Rebecca, if I may, just on one point that Susan just pointed out, the other learning from your research study was the whole notion of technology is not necessarily for technology's sake. It was what the millennials have said to us is technology and digital and social platforms reduces the drudgery of the day-to-day work so we can get on with things. We can move through the organization and our growth-oriented agenda. And technology is simply a way to do that as opposed to for its own sake. So certainly this generation that's up here on stage sees this as a fundamentally different enabler to getting work done because it just moves you through the system faster.
To your point earlier about the need for coaching and for feedback, if you can use technology to free up more time in your workday to do those kinds of things, and I use that term workday loosely, but if you can free up more time to do that, isn't technology a great thing? Right. Well, let's go on to another finding. We asked this question, whether or not CEOs of the future would be different. And so we looked at all of the millennial responses, regardless of their leader level, and we looked at the CEO responses. And we asked them to rank out of a whole list, which you'll see in a moment, what are the most important skills that a successful future CEO will have? Now, granted, a CEO is looking currently and then backward, and millennial leaders are looking from wherever they are in the journey forward. And so some of that may be more speculation than not. CEOs probably have a good grip. By the same token, CEOs may not always be thinking about how will the CEO need to be as opposed to the CEO I am, right? So having said that as the disclaimer, this is what they told us. So sitting CEOs said critical thinking was most important. Millennials didn't rank it as highly. CEOs also said that stakeholder management was going to be critically important, and you can see that millennials did not rank that very highly either. Business and management skills, very high in the minds of the CEOs as a future skill. about middle of the road, right in there with critical thinking for millennials. What millennials did say was most important was leadership impact. Now, if you had the definition in front of you, as those who filled out the survey at the time did, that was not only being effective in the business, but was also about your leadership style and your ability to bring people along, to be inspiring and engaging, which kind of goes back to the finding a moment ago. They also said interpersonal skills and global and cultural acumen were important. Given how mobile, how global in nature this generation is, not terribly surprising. But when we look at this, I think there are some conversations that perhaps might be had, and I'd ask, maybe starting with you, Heidi, if that, you know, the relative rank of stakeholder management, for example, or some of the things where millennials are not quite in sync, generally speaking, with CEOs.
Right.
I wondered if you had a thought there.
Well, I did. Certainly, stakeholder management was one that stuck out. You know, when you ask, are CEOs tomorrow going to be different, I think the answer is yes and no, right? The world around us is changing. We obviously have aspirations for our company tomorrow that are different from today. The role of a senior leader, though, has so much associated with stakeholder management, and perhaps it's a bit of not necessarily seeing that from their vantage point today, but being able to help them understand the importance of that and developing that capability. I know one of the things that we've started doing with leaders who are coming into leadership for the first time or transitioning to new leadership roles is you know, really helping them be effective in their first 90 days on the job. And we do spend quite a bit of time focusing on stakeholders. Who are your stakeholders in your role? How do you think about them? How do you establish those relationships to be successful? So that's one way of kind of bringing this into focus for them. What our millennials said they thought was important, I agree, is the whole global and cultural agility being absolutely critical. As a company that today has single-digit % of our population overseas, and yet the bulk of our backlog and sales being international, we certainly have an aspiration to become a truly global company. Today, there's only one member of our executive council that's ever worked outside the United States for the company, and I think tomorrow that's got to be different. And so, you know, both through experiential learning and some of the work that we're doing in leadership development, this is a big capability that we need to grow. And frankly, I think the millennial leaders see that need as well, so they're pulling on us.
Well, thank you, Heidi. Let me ask Short and Susan about, you know, you have sizable roles, you have big responsibilities. As you think about the ways in which you want to grow as leaders, is there a piece of this puzzle in stakeholder management or some of the business skills or some of the things that were higher on the CEO list that you kind of think about in your own development as you move through?
Yeah, I would definitely say from a stakeholder management, you see here in the aggregate it's lower. And I think maybe to Heidi's point is it's finding ways of, although I'm not a CEO today, what are my stakeholders that I'm supporting and how do I connect with them and make meaningful relationships so I can translate that as my career continues to grow. I think you see that global cultural acumen. You know, I've grown up in a connected world my whole life where I had access to information and people across the globe, and I think continuing to hone that from a business standpoint of like how do we lead and develop when we all have different cultures that we bring to the organization. I think that's a skill for me personally that I know I need to develop as I go forward in my career.
I agree with what Susan was just saying. I think the way I was looking and maybe was interpreting the stakeholder part was more, to me, that meant bureaucracy. Not being able to be efficient in what we do. And I think millennials were educated in a very different way. They were educated in team settings, and I think are slightly more natural collaborators kind of throughout a project versus having to run with something and then do your stakeholdering around it. But what really stood out to me on the millennial side is the leadership impact. And I think that certain millennial CEOs like Mark Zuckerberg, for example, are already showcasing this. Much more transparent, much more open. The ability to tell a story in a very inclusive and diverse way, getting a massive followership behind his leadership style. And I see that a lot of millennial leaders around me certainly are focused on replicating that at a smaller scale in the organizations they're trying to be effective at.
What I've learned with working with leaders like Short and others in our organization is their definition of stakeholder management is very different than my generation, which is it's an open model. And what gives me a ton of optimism when I read something like this and I talk to our millennial leaders in the organization is they will bring our organization to where the world needs to be. They'll take us right into that world, because this notion of the idea resides in this organization or in this part of the lab or this part of the organization. This generation is, the world's wide open. It's a wide open landscape. So innovation is be agnostic. Research, it's less research and development, it's more search and development. They're so connected and wired on a global scale that they're going to keep bringing ideas no matter where they reside. Now, what we're going to have to do with this generation of leaders coming through is work with them to be able to help them understand how to move the system. Large global companies like Boeing and Johnson & Johnson are global systems that in order to have impact, you have to define it in an outcome, a product, a service. And for us in healthcare, right, we're thinking about sensors, technology, wearables, things on devices, wellness. It's going to be this generation that brings that perspective into a traditional healthcare system and meet the world exactly where it needs to be. And that's, quite frankly, which gives me a lot of optimism with leaders like this coming through the system.
I think you're exactly on point. If you read stakeholder management as bureaucracy, I'm surprised it's not further down.
Exactly.
But I do think that, you know, to your point, these are well-established, long-standing brands, great track record. I think you're also 100 years old this year.
Yes, last year.
Last year, as were we at the conference board. You know, one of the things, I think your point is well taken around, you know, the larger brand. We also had participating in this study folks like Athena Health, which is both healthcare and tech play. And you know, you heard some of the same kinds of concerns about making sure that stakeholder management looks and becomes what it needs to be.
Mm-hmm.
So you know, we wanted to know, well, okay, do millennials only, you know, on one end of the spectrum? Do CEOs only live to work? And what we found is that no one is really on the far ends of the system, which is I think good. And I also think it's fairly realistic to know that as you have increasingly larger roles and more responsibility, that chances are more of your life are going to be subsumed into being successful at that. But no one was at the far ends of the spectrum, which was good. We also asked them about the values that they had, leadership values that they had at work. Right across the top, there is great alignment, and it is around ideas, technology, and rational problem solving. So if you were concerned before about critical thinking, don't be so concerned. It's across the board, everybody's on board. We're going to be successful because we have bright, capable people who can make great decisions and execute. So all that's great. You know, when you look at the next value on a fun, good company, and good times, seem to be a little higher with our millennials. Now, I would say that if you asked that of any generation at that life stage part of the journey, we would probably have all answered that as well. But a couple things popped up at me. So when you skip down a little bit, it talks about competition and attainment and worldly success, very high for millennials. And you know, sometimes that's a direct conflict with the headlines that we see. You know, I love these headlines that say, well, why aren't they buying houses? Okay, emerged into the workforce at the worst possible time, laden with school debt. And again, you know, not everyone, but you know, I mean, these are folks for whom those choices are not coming as easily. And so things make sense when you look at that, but there's at least the 2,800 or so that we spoke with, about half of whom you know, were millennial respondents. That is not something that they suffer from, which is a lack of ambition or a lack of a desire to do well. I think if you also look at creative and artistic self-expression, this surprised us. The CEOs, far beyond anyone else. When we had conversations with many of these folks, many of them have eclectic personal lives. And so they sometimes shared some of the things that they do, and you know, you just take notes and keep nodding. It's beautiful, you know. But it's amazing to me how they have put their lives together. And we're not going to show this slide today, but there's also a finding around how they look at social and mission and purpose. It's important to everybody. Every leader we spoke to, you know, came in very high. It's just that the CEOs tend to see the company as the vehicle through which they will do many of those things. Whereas millennials will tell you they have many other outlets in many other ways. And it's not that they don't want to work for a company whose values they respect and you know, they feel good about the brand, but it's not that that is the one touch point. So let me stop there and just say if anybody wants to hop in and comment on this particular
Susan,
point.
I'll just give one quick story. So I was a young female engineer starting at Boeing. I worked in a plant where I was the only woman on the team there, and I felt like I had to look and be a certain way to be accepted. And so, I mean, when I look back on the photos of the clothes I used to wear, I mean, I was trying to dress like a man, and it was awful, and I felt so stifled. I felt like I couldn't be myself, and it wasn't until I got the second job where I realized this is miserable for me. Like, I'm trying to be one person at work and another person at home. And I felt like you had to keep this hard divide. And the best advice I got is like, it's just called life balance. You only live one life. There's not work and there's not life separately. And so finding the ability to have my own creative self-expression in my role, to have fun at work and still drive and get things done, I think opened up a whole new world for me personally to enjoy the work I did. And I think people started to see who I was instead of this shy, quiet, why is she dressed like that? Those are very ill-fitting clothes, you know, and, you know, really just trying to find myself, and that, you know, really resonated with me.
So you missed the whole era of shoulder pads and bow ties. So I'm just grateful that I did not grow up in that time period with the internet, because, you know, those things just never go away.
Right.
It's just, you know, it's with you forever. So anything to add from your perspective, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I have the privilege to lead the recruiting organization for J&J, and we fill over 20,000 positions a year, many of which are millennials or millennials going into the company. And if you're part of these recruiting processes, I think you know, you get a front row seat to the questions millennials are asking, and what really drives them in their decision making for the companies they want to join. And I think reflecting on the last few years, what we're really seeing is the intersection of ambition and purpose is kind of the sweet spot. Because to give you an example, I was flabbergasted when I first joined the company, and now we have many recruiters around the world, and it's a very consistent thing to hear when I asked, why did you join J&J, or better yet, what's keeping you at J&J? And a very consistent answer I was getting was, you know, one of my family members passed away from XYZ disease, and I want to be the person who recruits this particular scientist to the company who can help us get one step closer to curing that disease. And for me, that's the intersection of purpose and ambition. And it gets really, really powerful that way. And I think to Susan's point, the work-life balance, we make such an investment under Peter's leadership and Alex's leadership to not just have the best performing workforce, but also the healthiest workforce as a company. And I think that starts to get into how do I define success? How do I define purpose in my life? And how does the company allow me to make something, to balance my work life that works well for me?
So, you know, what leaders like Heidi and myself have to do with millennials in our workforce is then begin to adapt global policies to ensure that we're attracting and retaining our lion's share of that talent in the marketplace. So part of what we have to do is have very, very progressive 21st century work-family integration policies, widen your definition of family. What this generation tells me every day is hold me accountable for the outcomes. How I go about doing that is really give me the flexibility. So I'll give you a very, very simple example. When we expanded our paid parental leave about 2 years ago for up to 17 weeks for working moms in the US, 9 weeks for dads, and expanded it to adoption and for really any definition of family. It was almost an afterthought on how we would actually have our employees take advantage of that time. And we just said, we're not smart enough to know how people should take it. So people can take that time any way they want it. They can slice it into long weekends, into 2 weeks or 6 weeks. That's an example of hold people accountable for the outcome. Let them live their lives. To Susan's point, you don't check yourselves at the door. This notion of I'm one person before I come into the door at Boeing or J&J and another person, this generation, they simply won't stand for that kind of position power, whoever's in the job has the influence. What I also find in this generation as it relates to work and life balance, they care less about hierarchy. They want people in the meeting who is going to actually have a perspective on a particular issue. So this notion of hierarchy, position, let's get to the answer and let's bring people around the table who can advance the agenda. And I think companies like Boeing and J&J have to continue to adapt their work policies accordingly.
I couldn't agree more with that, and I think we're intersecting with some total rewards optimization studies that we're doing and really trying to look deeply at this, and I love some of the things that you're talking about. I'd go back to this intersection of purpose and work, though, or purpose and mission, because if you think about the top scoring item on that chart, millennials having values around technology and ideas and sharing, our scores were off the charts at Boeing for the millennial leaders, and it has similar to what you described, this idea that I get to come to work at a place that literally the inventions, the work that they've done has shaped 100 years of world history, and what an incredible mission. What we've learned, though, that we need to be extremely mindful about is it's not just getting them in the door, it's the work that they're able to do from a very early age or very early stage on up. If we put them here to read a manual about something, they're gone. It's, are we good as leaders at setting the vision and giving them the big picture and helping describe how their work contributes to that, and then empowering them to let them go and do the work. Giving them some visibility. You talked about how, there's maybe a stigma associated with millennials. I was telling Rebecca before this, I mixed a bunch of millennials in with my most senior leaders, pre-C-suite leaders, at a session at our leadership center. And I worked so that they would be facilitating conversations and engaging with these folks on a variety of different topics. I literally left with a group of senior leaders who said, A, I better have a millennial on my leadership team because I'm missing the boat. B, I just created a slate of talent that I'm going to go after once I leave this room. I think, again, what we have in our head and then what we can help people experience about the capability and the passion of people, because we have to keep them living that value at work if we think we're going to hang on to them and continue to grow them.
And I think that's exactly right. And I think your point about, and well, both of you made this point, that millennials tend not to want to put up with things in quite the same way as earlier generations did. We've done away with the defined benefit and gone to defined contribution. And we've gone away with, the concept of working for a company and kind of spending your life there. It's lovely if it happens for all the right reasons, but, that's just not the world that these folks have inherited. And so when you ask yourself, in an earlier generation, some of us might have put up with a lot because we figured, okay, there's the pension or there's the whatever. Well, that contract's gone. So you have to think about, well, what is it that's going to keep someone? And you've all hit on, I think, many of the things, which is an opportunity to grow, an opportunity to have responsibility. And I have to say that of the millennial leaders with whom I had an opportunity to interact, I was so impressed collectively with what these folks are doing. I can't even describe, I'm sorry, I can't describe what you're doing. It's just, there's some intense things, they keep planes in the air, and they nuclear things. Okay, fine. But that's my issue. All right, so we wanted to know whether or not millennial leaders are more or less engaged than their non-millennial counterparts. And we have all kinds of stuff out there. Job hop, they leave, they're not in bed. That's not what we found. We found that they are just as engaged as any other leadership cohort. And we also found that when we asked them, how many years do you think you will stay at this company? Which says a lot about the culture, but it also says a lot about their own perceived career trajectory. So we asked them, you look at this, and 49% of them are going to stay 10 years or more. That negates all of the headlines around, job hoppers, and if you don't give them everything they want, but they're out of here. And that's not what we found. There's a slide at the end. We may not get a chance to get to it, but we asked people about their own expectations about being promoted. And most of them felt that they were being promoted at a fairly good clip early on. They were also realistic that as you go up the leadership ladder, those promotions are going to be longer term, or there's more time in between. And they were very realistic about this and know that they are comparing not only their cohort at the company, everybody else in their social network or in their world, right? So they were very good about understanding the process, but feeling very good about the opportunities that had been given to them with their respective firms. So I'll stop there. And Susan, do you want to start the ball rolling here on engagement and what you think?
Sure. I think for me personally, the thing that really resonated, like Rebecca was saying, we see all these headlines like, hey, they're just job hopping. And that hasn't been my case at all. I've been at Boeing for 13 years, ever since I finished undergrad. And I think what really matters to me, and I think it resonates with our generation, is the intentionality of the development. And so being, like Rebecca mentioned, early in my career, I felt like the trajectory was on a certain level. And then I hit kind of mid-leadership, and it didn't look the same anymore, but feeling like it's still been very intentional. The moves may have been lateral instead of promotions, but there's a clear investment. And that spoke volumes to me, because there's something within me that definitely says, like, if I'm not growing, I'm dying. So I can't handle, like, feeling like I'm in a corner, like, okay, well, just, we developed you for a bit and that's it, and so maybe it's that we all got trophies as a kid, you read that headline too, that has somehow contributed to my attitude here. But I really think that it's inspiring to hear that we are very loyal as a generation, as the data suggests, but we're not blindly loyal, right? And so it does take some intentionality and some connection points and transparency that's maybe a little different than what previous generations expected in terms of development and growth in an organization.
Thank you, Susan.
We actually talked about this at breakfast this morning. Yeah. And I think what was really neat about Susan's story is just how critical her manager was, her mentor was, in coming up to her in this sort of senior manager mode where it felt like things were slowing down, to be able to talk to you about, you're very much on the radar screen, and here are some of the things that we think you could be destined for in the future. What are your aspirations, right, and how do we work your development plan? So important what we do, and how we interact at that point.
Absolutely.
Part of what we try to do here as it relates to engagement of our millennial leaders is, and we were talking on the way down here, the whole power of reverse mentoring in a more formal way, where millennials can work with different cohorts of leaders to stay connected. And I think the learnings go back and forth. We also try to move our organization in very big ways. So in rooms like this, several times a year, when we have our top 100 to 150 J&J leaders, just imagine for a moment when you're in a room like this, and we bring leaders like Short and others of his generation to come on stage throughout the course of a 2 or a 3-day session and talk to the most senior leaders of J&J on how they are experiencing the organization in terms of speed, accountability, various work environmental issues, where we can move very large blocks of our senior leaders by storytelling and by having our millennials talk about what they love about J&J. And I think Short is right. Its purpose, its mission, and we find an unbelievable connection bringing people into the organization. I think Heidi's absolutely right. At the end of the day, we know people join companies, they leave managers. So our job within the system is to make sure that our managers are creating the environments inside their units so this generation can feel engaged, driven purposely, feel as though they can learn. No policy is going to change that. What will change that in a system of a company are the managers you have leading these units. So what we try to do is have leaders like Short and others come on stage and talk to our leadership ranks on, here's what's working, here's what you can do to be even more effective, and you can move the system a little bit faster by having stories told by this generation and in a very inspiring manner.
Now, Short, I'm going to show 2 more findings, and then I'm going to come to you for your thoughts. We asked about how millennial leaders want to grow. And so, by the way, I didn't ask the CEOs about their level of engagement. We just hope and we assume. In this one, we did ask them, what are the experiences that will shape your leadership journey? And again, CEOs are looking backward and others are looking from wherever they are, forward. And so leading through transformation, the first across the board, you can see that millennial leaders and non-millennial leaders were in lockstep in terms of the relative rank of those 5. They are leading through transformation, feedback from a manager, guidance from a mentor, shifting from one business unit to another, and managing through a crisis. For everyone other than the CEO, collectively speaking, in the aggregate, those were the top choices. You can see that CEOs saw it a little differently. They did not look at feedback from a manager with the same kind of high importance. Now, if I had phrased it as feedback from your board or from, if I changed this a little different, it might have been a different outcome. But they thought that managing through a crisis was the second most important thing. And they also picked something that none of the other groups did in the top 5 anyway, about growing a new business. And in fact, I remember sitting in front of Ken Chenault talking about an experience he had at American Express, who was given a failing unit, and he managed through that. But he also talked about launching things, and we heard that across the board. So when you think about if those are the right experiences, how do you develop these leaders? This is a little bit of an eye chart, but what's important here is that you can see that developmental assignments are both the most effective and the things that they want the most. They find them highly effective. Now, it doesn't have to be a formal international assignment necessarily where you're sending the whole family, although we did have a great story about that yesterday, didn't we? But I would say that if you look at what else is important, it's about coaching. Coaching from peers, coaching from a manager, coaching from an external person, a mentor. There's certainly a role for formal learning, but to your point earlier, Peter, it's not about technology-supported learning. Now, in fairness, this is a question about how do you learn leadership? And I would argue that much of this has to be done through experience and from senior leaders. So having said that, may I start with you? Sure.
I think what's not on any of these slides, but I know certainly has made me develop the way I have, and I hope to be developed even more, is the ability to be pushed into a stretch role a little bit earlier in your career, right? So I think I've been very lucky with Peter taking, and I think we need to take this phrase out of our vocabulary, like taking a risk on someone. But I think it's really putting someone in a stretch role that really takes you to a whole different level. And I almost equate that to managing through a crisis or setting up a new business, because in a real stretch role, that will cover both aspects of it.
Well, companies aren't going to have the luxury of not doing that, right? We looked at millennials, there were 75 million at their peak. Gen X is 50 million. You've got a millennial generation that's 83 million, and there simply aren't enough Gen Xers left in the workplace to fill all the open spots. And the boomers who are finally leaving, and the Gen Xers go, please, there's the door. Could you just put your hand on the handle of the door? Could you go? But you're going to have to do that because you don't have another choice. Those millennial leaders will need to step up. Probably.
That's why I like to keep them very close to me.
They're going to have to step up, and companies are going to have to tap them earlier than perhaps they might have at other times. So thank you for starting us off. And wondered if Heidi or Susan, you had some thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think I really echoed what Short said there about, it's really important. I feel like, obviously you saw coaching and mentoring as a really dominant theme in the millennials. And I think there's still now, especially when you get to the mid-career, where there's this fear of like, is she really ready? We don't want to put her in a role and watch her fail. But I think for our generation, we really thrive on that. And I resonate with what he was saying about that kind of is our managing through a crisis. When we get into the job and we're like, oh my gosh, how did I get here? I wasn't ready. But you've got the support system around you to support you, and you grow fast because you have to deliver quickly. And I think that is the continued challenge as we watch the spots open, of not waiting till like, okay, she's checked every box, she's finally ready. Because at that point, I felt like I was dying for 2 years. Right. And so to really take that next step and take it, and not to see it as a risk, but really that's how we're going to develop and push that next generation to be ready for the next roles.
Yeah, I just think it's a conversation we need to keep having. I mean, the same person who says, boy, I grew because people pushed me, people were retiring and I had to take that job, and that's how I got to where I am today, is the same person who will say, boy, there's a lot of risk if something goes wrong here, and particularly I think in the business that we're in, they're not ready. And it's just, we have to kind of keep bringing ourselves back. And also, I think taking on the things when we have folks who are in roles who probably ought to be someplace else, taking that on, so we open up these opportunities for folks who are ready and can start to get some of those experiences.
Absolutely.
I think part of the challenge in companies at times on this particular issue is we sometimes know our people too well, and we know every element of the gaps in their experience, and we try to de-risk it. And what I try to do when I'm in situations like this with our senior leaders is to remind us that when someone put them in their role at earlier part of their career, there was someone sitting around a table saying, I'm not quite sure if they can do it. But they did it, and they surrounded themselves with support and mentoring. And one of the big things that came out of this piece of research was this notion of sponsorship is a non-negotiable as you put people into, and again, this generation values sponsorship at a very, very high rate. And part of the trick here now is, can you get people to take these very, very big assignments and ensure that there's the right kind of sponsorship around them in a global world where teams are disaggregated? But it's incumbent upon organizations like ours to ensure that the support system is around them in real ways to ensure that the pipelines are strong for the companies like Boeing and J&J in the future.
You know, I think it's so true. We're all very, very clear about how confident we currently are. And we forget how freaked out we were when we were first tapped for something.
Absolutely.
Right? I already talked about this. You know, we can talk about millennials all day long, but, you know, a lot of companies we talk to now are worried about Generation Z. And they're in your internship classes coming in, and that's the next, and I don't mean to be depressing, but we will be thinking about generations in the workplace, and I think it's important to try to figure out, you know, is there something different? But at the end of the day, the millennial leaders with whom we spoke said they wanted to work for a place where they aligned with their values. They wanted to do work that was important. They wanted to be treated with respect. They wanted to be compensated fairly, and they wanted to learn and grow. Well, let's just take a moment. I think every generation wants that. And so, you know, being careful not to overcorrect for one generation or another, I think is important. But to Peter's point, you know, when you put those kinds of workplace policies in place, those help everyone. Absolutely. And makes for a much more engaged environment. Let me close with this. I'm hopeful that we have a few minutes. If you have some questions that perhaps we could help, particularly the folks on the panel. It was a distinct privilege to work on this, but it's also a distinct privilege to be among you today. Thank you again for your support of this project and for being here. Thank you. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed seeing the presentation that we had at the CLO Symposium. And the good news here is that we're going to make this report available to all of you. And you'll see an opportunity to download the slides from today. And it's just the slides that wrap around the video. But if you go to slide 7, just as you see here on the screen, there's a hyperlink that will take you to a landing page, and you can download this report for your further exploration. And there's also likely to be a link in the chat box, so you can do that as well. So hopefully you'll take advantage of that. I also hope that you'll let us know if you're interested, because we're going to continue this research and broaden this now to hundreds of companies. Our hope here is that you'll be able to assess your leaders and benchmark your leaders, and be able to have some interactive data that will allow you to continue the research at your own organizations. So let me switch gears just a little bit and give Mike an opportunity to talk about the next exciting thing that is on the horizon. Mike, would you share a little bit?
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. And I think what really stood out to me about that conversation that we just watched that happened last year at the CLO Symposium is a couple things. Number one is just the incredible substance and richness of the data and research that Conference Board did. And then two, it is the fact that we actually brought millennial leaders to come and talk about the experience from their own perspective. And I think that is something that is ignored way too often when it comes to talking about leadership and millennials, that we really need to have that sort of real experience of it as a lived thing for the people who we're talking about. So I think those two things, the real practical experience and application of it from people who are living it and breathing it, as well as the substance of the research, are two things that I think separate the CLO Symposium experience. We really strive to bring those two things to the fore when we are putting together our conference. As Rebecca mentioned, we have our spring 2018 CLO Symposium coming up next month, March 26th through 28th in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. We've got an incredible lineup of speakers. The panel that we just watched is just a small sample of what you can, the type of thing you can see over the 3 days of the symposium. This year, we're making the theme Reimagining the Learning Experience. And so we've got a couple of panel discussions there talking about learning experience and what does that mean, and how do we develop a modern digital learning experience that is really engaging for the audience. We're going to be talking about the future of corporate university. We've got some wonderful chief learning officers and learning execs who are going to be sharing and speaking, folks from AT&T, from GE, from Chase, from the NBA, Walmart, a number of leading companies that are going to be joining us there. So I hope those of you who are watching today will consider joining us. I am authorized by our events department to offer a discount off the registration fee to the folks who are listening today or tuning in later on demand. We have a $300 discount off of the full registration rate that we can make available to those of you who are attending today and are watching. Just use the promo code Conference Board 2018, Conference Board 2018 when you're registering, and that'll make you eligible for that discounted rate. So thank you again for listening today. Thank you for Rebecca for bringing us together and sharing not just this video, but also your expertise and perspective last year when we were at the symposium.
Outstanding. And you know, Mike, I think that's the beauty of this, is getting together with people who are facing similar challenges, have great stories to share, and symposiums are always terrific. I'll leave our attendees with a couple of different opportunities that they might want to continue to explore, particularly in this diversity or generational space. But let me close by saying a big thank you to you, Mike, for joining me today and giving me the opportunity to be part of this symposium. And I also want to thank all the folks who carved out some time to be with us today so that we could share. And I do want to encourage you to get involved in the next phase of the research, and should be a lot of fun. So I'll leave you with that thought. Hope to see you at the symposium. Thanks again, Mike. Take care, everybody.